All right, welcome everyone to the Recess Summer Research Spotlight. We are so excited that you are all here to learn about what our Recess interns have been up to this summer. My name is Becky McKean, and I am a Geo Workforce Associate 2 at EarthScope Consortium. I am part of the internship team, and I am also the program lead for the Recess and the Geo Launchpad programs. Other members of the internship team who are all on this call include Kelsey Druce, Geo Workforce Associate 2, Barbara Reynolds, Community Engagement Coordinator, and Matt Dawson, Engagement Manager. We were also supported by two amazing alumni mentors this year. Our Recess alumni mentor, Elashua Shepard, a graduate student at Purdue University, and a former Recess intern himself. And our Geo Launchpad alumni mentor, Sebastian Griego, who is currently a graduate student at the University of New Mexico and was a former Geo Launchpad intern. So a big thanks to this team for all of their hard work and their help with the Recess program this year. Please note some expected behavior for today's event. We will strictly follow EarthScope's Code of Conduct. This means being mindful of providing a safe, productive, and welcoming environment for all participants. We also ask that you kindly remember to stay muted in order to reduce distractions for our speakers. So, what is RESESS? In case you are not entirely familiar with the program, Research Experiences in Solid Earth Science for Students, or RESESS, is a highly competitive summer internship program for undergraduate students to gain geophysics research experience. It is an 11-week program. This year it ran from May 31st to August 14th, so their last day is actually tomorrow. And this year we have 10 recess interns coming from 8 different states. Students accepted into this program began by attending an in-person orientation week at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque alongside interns from 2 other EarthScope internship programs. This week included field exercises with technical equipment. You can see some of the photos on the right of their experiences. There were professional development seminars and also community building. Interns then flew or drove to their project locations where they spent 10 weeks working on a mentored research project, receiving professional development training from EarthScope staff and receiving support from EarthScope staff and their alumni mentor. This experience will conclude with a poster presentation at the American Geophysical Union Conference, which will take place in San Francisco, California in December. So make sure you stop by their posters if you're at that meeting, because all 10 students have already successfully submitted their abstracts for this meeting, which is fantastic. So where did our interns go this summer? Our interns worked at institutions in 8 different states across the U.S. this year, including California, Hawaii, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Washington. Their institutions included universities and federal government agencies. This year, we intentionally worked to try to pair interns together whenever possible. So before our interns begin their presentations, I would like to acknowledge our funding support, which makes this entire internship program possible. This program is supported by the National Science Foundation National Geophysical Facility, operated by EarthScope Consortium. I would also like to acknowledge additional support for the program that you can see listed there on the slide, including our project mentors, many of whom are on the call as well. So for today, our agenda will include 5-minute presentations from all 10 of our interns. Note that we will proceed directly from one presentation into the next. Please feel free to type any questions that you might have. If you can associate a name with them, that makes it easier for us to ask the questions at the end. So please type those into the chat, and we will hold a brief Q&A following the presentations. You are welcome to shower them with applause using your Zoom emoji feature after they conclude their presentations, but we will move right from one into the next. So with that being said, we are ready to get started. So our first presentation will be by Lucero Tunjar Cruz from the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. Her project was under the direction of Dr. Joshua Crozier at the United States Geological Survey, California Volcano Observatory in Moffett Field, California. Her title is Modeling Deformation in the Long Valley Caldera, California.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that introduction. To start off, Long Valley Caldera is the result of the Bishop Tuff super eruption that happened 760,000 years ago. And since the 80s, it's been the subject of multiple inflation episodes and seismic swarms. But since about 2020, it's actually been pretty seismically quiet and deflating. And so we kind of wanted to constrain the source of deformation, see what's going on using some probabilistic inversions and comparing our results with kind of some other conclusions that other studies have come to. So, before delving into the inversions, we kind of had some initial ideas about the source. So first, we kind of noticed that across inflation and deflation episodes, there seemed to be a similar pattern, like a radial pattern of deformation for both. That kind of suggested that there might be a common source of deformation. So we wanted to confirm this hypothesis with our inversions and also ask ourselves some questions like how much do non-volcanic signals interfere with the quality of inversions? So onto testing our data. So different source geometries, such as like a compact sphere versus an elongated tilted body, like a spheroid, will produce different surface deformation patterns. So our goal is to test several source models and compare how well of each explains the data, because that tells us something about, what the system looks like. So we tested a penny-shaped horizontal crack, which is kind of similar to a sill, and then a rectangular crack with a tilt with some sort of strike and dip. But we found that our best fitting models were the sphere and the ellipsoid. But one interesting thing we found was that across deflation and inflation episodes for all of our models, the deflation episodes regularly returned a depth that was much shallower compared to the inflation episode. So there was a bit of a depth discrepancy. So we were curious as to what was causing that, why we were seeing that in the data. So that motivated us to do some data corrections. So some things we did was changing reference frames, kind of looking in the reference of different stations to see how we could view the data in different ways. And because the area is kind of complex, like there's a lot of complex regional tectonics, we kind of applied some approximate tectonic corrections and approximate hydrological corrections. So the tectonic corrections were based on time periods where there was minimal caldera activity. Caldera wasn't doing very much, so you can kind of infer that a lot of the motion that's going on there is tectonically associated rather than associated with the caldera. And hydrological corrections were based on surrounding stations. For the inflation episodes, we noticed that north of the caldera, near the Inyo craters, there was a lot of uplift that was likely associated, at least in part, by hydrological corrections or hydrological influence. So we removed that effect. And we found that after we corrected the data, that the depth discrepancy largely went away. It was still kind of, there's still a bit of a remnant of the depth discrepancy within a kilometer or so, but we think that falls within uncertainty, or kind of loosely constrained uncertainty. And so we still think it's the same source across the inflation and deflation episodes. But our big takeaway was that it does really matter how you apply tectonic corrections, how you decide to account for non-volcanic signals, and if you decide to do it at all. That does seem to have enough power to kind of influence your results, push your data around, push your inversions around. So that was kind of our big takeaway. And that's not something that has been really hinged upon in the past in other work. So we think that's important. And second of all, we decided that between the sphere and the ellipsoid models that kind of had the best fit, we found that the ellipsoid model kind of provides a better visual fit, especially here down south. We noticed that the light blue vectors are the model and the dark blue vectors are the observations. So the light blue vectors kind of align a little bit better for the ellipsoid model compared to the sphere model, but not robustly enough to claim superiority over another model. And so we think that they're both still decently good fits. And acknowledgements. Yeah, I'd like to thank my mentor. I'd like to thank everybody here at CalVO, and I would love to thank the EarthScope team and the NSF for all the support for what was a really amazing summer. I couldn't have done it without y'all, so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucero. Our next presentation is by Morgan Rife from Radford University in Radford, Virginia. Morgan's project was under the direction of Dr. Thomas Lee at the University of Hawaii in Hilo, Hawaii. Her title is ISAM, USAM, WeSAM, Developing a New Tool for Analyzing Historical Seismograms.
Thank you for that introduction. Okay. My project is based in Hawaii, and Hawaii specifically has a really lovely long history of seismic recording. Now, these seismic recordings historically are not digital like typical recordings today. They're on paper analog seismograms. But these historical recordings hold a lot of really interesting data about what happened on the island during these times in the past. And specifically, my team was curious about what happened in 1974. The year 1974 had some really interesting eruptions, and so we wanted to try and constrain magma movement during this time. Now, typically with digital data, when you try to constrain magma movement, you'll use a method called RSAM, which is real-time seismic amplitude measurements. We couldn't do this method because we have scanned physical images. So we needed to come up with a new tool to be able to tell the difference between average seismic amplitude changes in an image. And so we came up with something called ISAM. ISAM is image intensity seismic amplitude measurements. And so basically, ISAM employs the idea that in a typical 8-bit image, like this very cute picture of this cat in the bottom right, you'll have a scale of brightness from 0 to 256. And so if we apply that same idea to an 8-bit image of a scanned seismogram, split that seismogram up in rows and columns based upon time, we can take the average value from 0 to 256 of each of those rows and columns, and that average value of brightness will be average seismic amplitude. And so applying this idea, once we have those values of average seismic amplitude, we want to plot them across time so that we can more clearly see patterns and signal. And I created 3 tools to do so, the first of which is read time series. And so read time series simply plots those average seismic amplitude values from before ISAM across time. And so it stitches together and aligns 24-hour-long files. It removes a little bit of the beginning and end of those files so that we get rid of the noise of splicing those file ends together. And then it smooths over all of the data to get rid of some noise that come from random bright scanned images. Now, the issue with read time series is it's reading in raw data, right? And so if you have a series of time, like 3 months in this image, which is scanned at a different exposure than the rest of the data, you'll have an error that looks like the data is removed from the rest of the data on the y-axis. This is pretty simply, it's an easy fix, right? So we just needed to create a new tool that would rescale this data. And so the second tool I created is that tool. It's FixedDips, and all FixedDips does is employ a pretty typical rescaling formula to that problematic time length. And it rescales the data to match the rest of the data on the y-axis so that you can compare and contrast those lows and highs. And so once we have these individual time series, we needed a way to compare multiple time series from different locations together. And so that's the last tool I created. This is plot time series. It's a pretty simple tool. All it does is plot those tools from before together for multiple stations. But it unlocks a really valuable element to this study, which is not only do we get to compare temporal change, but we get to compare spatial change between multiple stations. So we can see these peaks at certain stations are associated with higher ISAM, and higher ISAM is associated with higher tremor. And these lows are associated with lower ISAM, which is associated with a lower tremor. So we can see how those change throughout the year and across different areas. And so in conclusion, these tools that we created are really valuable because we were able to bypass the need to go in and hand trace seismic trace through all 3,000 of the images that we reviewed. And instead of doing that, we could simply use these tools and take average values from the images and plot them across time. So we turned these stacks of seismic images that look like this into these really easily interpretable time series that you can compare and contrast in a matter of minutes. So thank you. I'd like to acknowledge all these wonderful people.
Thank you, Morgan. Our next presenter is Alastair McCarthy from the University of California, Berkeley in Berkeley, California. Alastair also did his project under the direction of Dr. Thomas Lee at the University of Hawaii in Hilo, Hawaii. His title is Reanalyzing the Analog Seismograms of Kilauea's 1974 Eruptions.
So, building off of what Morgan's gone over in her presentation, my job was analyzing and comparing the actual magma flux that we've looked into. So we'll get into that. So why do these past seismograms even matter in the first place? For the majority of seismology's history, we've only had these analog physical records to actually look at plenty of events. So these records are incompatible with a lot of forms of modern digital analysis, such as RSAM, that you've seen a little bit of with Morgan's presentation. And they also record plenty of unique events, such as the 1974 Southwest Rift Zone eruption at Kilauea, Hawaii, which also erupted in 2024. So we have two examples, one in very recent time where this thing has erupted. And currently, there's only earthquake count data available for a lot of these eruptions, basically. So those don't really constrain tremor very much to a certain area, so we can go investigate it. So why do we even care about these tremors? As Morgan said, we do use it as a proxy for magma flux and flow. So on the left, you can see is ISM data from a one-day analog seismogram, and you can see the volcanic tremor signal circled in red has a very clear signal that we can then analyze over longer periods of time. And as I've said, those earthquake counts don't go by station. They go by the entire region of Kilauea. So that makes things a lot more difficult to sort of constrain to one specific area. So we are investigating, in particular, we settled on 4 stations for our analysis, even though we digitized easily over 18 or something. And each station has 1 seismogram a day for 8 months. And across these 8 months, we have 3 eruptions that were recorded. 2 at the summit, which is closest to NPT or North Pit Station, and then 1 at the Southwest Rift Zone, which is between North Pit and Desert Station. We also have Pauahi to the east, and then Mauna Loa up on the top to the north. And in terms of our spatial and temporal events that you've heard a little bit about, we are in particular looking for, 1, we want to look for magma flux around these eruptions. And then 2, we want to understand whether or not there are differences between these stations across all these stations across this period of time. So we have been able to, so on the left there is the summer. So we have 1 eruption that was recorded there, and we can sort of see that Desert and North Pit have a signal afterwards, and Pauahi and Mauna Loa, conversely, kind of don't. So we can then take a look at all of our time, and overall, we found that North Pit has a lot of magma flux. Conveniently, the station that is directly on top of the summit has a lot of magma flux, you would guess. But that is a very valid result and very important to acknowledge, because previously we had ambiguity across the entirety of Kilauea. So we found that this method has been very successful in constraining this magma flux to certain regions. So we had NPT, had plenty of activity across both the summit eruptions, and then precursory activity to the Southwest Rift Zone eruption, which happens, we don't get a massive peak there because it happens on December 31st, and we don't have data into 1975. But we do at least get to see some pretty cool precursory activity in November there. Um, and then we also found that Hawaii, or POW in pink in the bottom left, has a massive signal at the beginning of June as well. So overall, we found that our methods have been very successful in sort of narrowing down our resolution and seeing and investigating these past volcanic tremors better, that can then be applied further across other systems. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's been involved with this project, everyone at EarthScope, all of the people at the University of Hawaii Hilo who have been great help. And thank you.
Great job, Alastair. Thank you. Our next presentation is by Sandra Hernandez from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia. Her project was under the direction of Dr. Nathan Anderson at the United States Geological Survey, Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington. Sandra's title is Exploring Glacier Peak's Most Recent Eruption.
Thank you for that introduction, Becky. All right, so Glacier Peak is a volcano up in remote northern Cascades in Washington state, and it's actually one of the most explosive volcanoes in the Cascade Range. So in post-glacial time, we've had two Plinian eruptions back to back. These occurred about 13.6 thousand years ago, and these were actually more voluminous than the famous 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. They distributed ash eastward out to Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And these eruptions were also associated with pyroclastic flows, which flowed all the way down to the Puget Sound lowland, which of course now is heavily populated. However, despite all of this, the dynamics of its most recent eruption remains poorly studied. So prior work has established that we've observed that there is this thin layer of light gray fine ash that has been noted on the east and west side of the edifice. And we call this the grassroots ash because it's just a few centimeters under the grassroots, the actual soil at the top of the on the forest floor. And the goal for my project was to make some preliminary textual observations of these potential candidate samples. Do they share similar characteristics? Do they seem to be formed from the same event? And then explore some implications of what the surface texture of the clasts that make up these samples, what does that tell us about eruption dynamics? And so in order to do this, we went out to the field. We had one outcrop, which had a date to a few hundred years ago. However, no ash had ever been collected at this outcrop. So we went out to the backcountry, we found this outcrop, and I was able to collect a few new ash samples, as well as some additional bulk soil and also charcoal fragments to send out for radiocarbon dating. And so this is what the outcrop looked like. If you look on the left, this is a simplified strat column of all the layers that we saw. And up at the top, there's that thin gray layer, that's the grassroots candidate ash. And then this is just a close-up picture of it. You can see it's about 2 centimeters thick. And then I went back to the lab, and so I analyzed 6 samples in total. 5 had been previously collected, and then the 6th was this new ash that I collected this summer. And I was able to split these the clasts in these samples into different categories based on their texture. So this ranged from low to high vesicularity, as well as low to high microlight content, as well as any class that appeared to be altered or oxidized, and any crystals that I saw. And then while doing this, I was actually able to I discovered some additional charcoal in some samples that we didn't know was there. So that'll give us a few additional data points for radiocarbon dates, which will be great. And then I was curious, I looked at a total of 2,700 total clasts this summer. And so here are our preliminary results. So if you look at this, you can see most of our samples had a consistent assemblage of these different textures. So we had, 5 out of 6, you could see all of these 6 different textures. However, we did have one clear outlier. So if you look in the bottom right, this sample was almost, more than half was altered material, altered lithics, and then some crystals. So I was able to identify, okay, these 5 look similar. So if we want to investigate the grassroots ash more, we should focus on these 5 for future research. In some early conclusions that can be hypothesized, since all of these 5 samples had highly vesicular clasts, that suggests that this eruption probably had fast magma ascent. So there's when the magma erupted, there was still a lot of volatiles in all of these clasts. And I saw there was a low percentage of altered lithics as well. So that suggests this eruption was probably less explosive than the prior eruptions of Glacier Peak. And that matches some prior volumetric estimates that have been made. And since most of these clasts they looked fresh, fresh glass that had been cooled down, we can assume this eruption was probably magmatic, probably had fresh magma associated with it, as opposed to a dome collapse or just a steam eruption. And yeah, with my project, I was able to contribute to the knowledge of Glacier Peak's eruptive history, which is so important for geologists and volcanologists who put together these hazard maps. Personally, I was able to gain an incredible geological field experience. I had never been backpacking, and I was able to learn how to prepare an outcrop to be looked at, collect my own samples, and take my own field notes. And yeah, future work is needed to make sure that the composition of these samples are in fact distinct from prior eruptions. And we should get some radiocarbon dates back in the following months, which will provide more context and more data points to confirm the age of this eruption. And yeah, thank you for everyone who supported me this summer.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandra. Our next presentation is by Isabella Chuchro from Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. Bella's project was under the direction of Dr. Sarah Sayedi at the University of Nevada in Reno, Nevada. Her title is Geolocating the Reno-Carson Dark Fiber Using Tap Tests and GPS-Tracked Vehicle Signals.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. So my project included working with distributed acoustic sensing to geolocate a portion of dark fiber from Reno to Carson City, Nevada. So distributed acoustic sensing, or DAS, is a relatively new geophysical method that uses fiber optic cable. So we send lasers down the cable, record backscattered signal, and that gives us information about strain along the fiber. The results are kind of similar to a seismic array, but one benefit of DAS is that it can include very dense sampling over a very long fiber length. And DAS can be used on fiber installed by geophysicists for this purpose specifically, or on what's called dark fiber. And dark fiber is just any fiber optic cable not currently in use. There's a lot of dark fiber all over the world. There's always a surplus. Telecommunication companies have historically just put out a lot. And terrestrially, it's usually under urban areas, which is what one of the benefits of my fiber is. But the problem with dark fiber is that like geoscientists didn't install it. So there's these things called like fiber loops or slack, or areas with poor coupling with the ground, and all these things can cause signal loss during DAS acquisition. So my project included identifying which channels were good, and you can think of a channel as like a portion of fiber, and then actually locating them. So how do we find the bad channels so we can ignore them? We look at a big earthquake. We were lucky enough to record a big earthquake during our DAS acquisition, and this caused strain across the entire fiber instantaneously. So we can identify bad channels as those not experiencing strain during this event. So with those bad channels ignored, how did we actually locate the good ones? So we drove a car that we tracked with GPS along the fiber length because we knew where it started, ended, and roughly that it followed this highway. And that produced a low frequency strain response that we recorded with DAS. But the car's signal can be hard to see sometimes, and it can get confusing with other cars and stuff. So we use tap tests as anchor points because they produce very distinct signals, and we know exactly where and when those were conducted. So they help us orient ourselves. And a lot of my work consisted of aligning the GPS tracked path of the vehicle with its strain response. And this gives us the specific points of each good channel along the fiber. We were able to geolocate around 83% of the entire fiber, which featured around 96% of the good usable channels. And in this figure in the right here, you can see like a geologic map of the area with some main lithologic units labeled. There's a lot of faulting. That's one of the main things we're trying to study in this area is like active faulting or maybe potentially like buried dormant faults. And you can see the geolocated fiber, but at this scale, it's kind of hard to tell that it's any different than just the highway. So if you zoom in on that kind of white square there and you blow it up, you can see that you can see the exact geometry relative to the road. And one thing I thought was interesting doing this project was that we originally thought before we geolocated it that it probably lies closer to the northbound side of the highway because we were seeing cars driving northbound, that we were seeing those signals more strongly. And that's what we found when we ended up geolocating it. So with this fiber geolocated, we can now use it to monitor local earthquakes, potentially aftershocks, maybe epicenter locating. We can also use it to monitor DAS responses to soil moisture. There's a lot of local geothermal activity in the area as well that we'd like to use this fiber to study. Yeah, so thank you to everyone who helped me with this project.
Thank you, Bella. Our next presenter is Miranda Macias from the University of Texas in El Paso, Texas. Her project was under the direction of Dr. Hong Chen at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa. Miranda's title is Benchmarking Deep Learning Frameworks for Electrical Resistivity Tomography Inversion.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Miranda. So I'm excited to show you my work here at the University of Iowa and how it went. So just some background and motivation. So groundwater is where a lot of our drinking water comes from. It's important for our farms, for our ecosystems, and managing it well means knowing where that water sits, actually sits underground. So one way to find out is to put these electrodes in the ground and send a small electrical current through and measure how easily it flows. And water-rich ground conducts electricity differently from like dry rock. So from these measurements at the surface, a computer can work backwards and build a picture of what's below. That's called electrical resistivity tomography, for short ERT. So here's the catch, and it's basically why the motivation for my project exists. Many completely different underground pictures explain the same surface measurements, equally well. And that data alone cannot tell you which one is real. So imagine you describe an animal to 7 artists who've never seen the animal you're describing. Every drawing fits your description, but they draw 7 different animals, basically. So your description wasn't wrong, it just wasn't enough. So that's like kind of my problem exactly. The measurements are the description, the pictures of the underground are the drawings. So the computer has to assume something about what the ground should look like. Usually assumes the ground changes smoothly. And that assumption isn't in the data, it's the choice that we make. And it answers, the answer you get. And here's us out in the field, conducting our little ERT survey, as you can see here. And so going forward, so same data, different answers. So up here, this top row, we have two pictures of the same patch of ground made by 2 different methods. Obviously, as you can tell, it's not the same picture. The bottom is what each one predicts we measure. They agree with each other to within a 1.5%, and our measurements are only good to 1.5% anyway. So the measurements cannot tell us which is right. Not with better math, not with a bigger computer, the information isn't there. And going forward, so for example, like 7 artists, same description. So basically, my project asked is, what if we let a neural network make that assumption instead? Not replacing the physics, that stays exactly the same. The only thing that changes is how we describe the underground picture. Instead of listing a value for every square in a grid, a network takes a position and returns a resistivity. So I've been working on building a benchmark. What we have here are 7 different methods, all given the same measurements, the same physics, same noise, and the same starting point. So we have 2 standard approaches, as we can see right here, and 5 neural network designs. Those really trip you up. This figure shows what each one recovered. On the far left is the truth, 2 buried blocks, as we can see here. Everything to the right is a methods attempt. You can see some find both blocks. You can see some smear them into one just didn't finish out at all, as we can see here. So going forward, some results and observations. Basically, the first result that I got was clear that the standard method looked about 50% better. But before writing that down, I checked one thing just to be fair. I had given every network the same size and the same amount of computing time. So I looked at my own instructions and had given all 7 artists. So basically, I'm gonna use the analogy again. I looked at my own instructions. Can say I had given all 7 artists the same 10 minutes and the same brush, to be fair. But some of them may have needed more time, and some of them maybe needed a finer brush. I had not been measuring their skill. I had been measuring my instructions that I had given these models. One network that I had written off as unable to solve the problem just needed more time than I allowed. The 50% gap I talked about, once each method got the settings that suited it, that gap shrank to nothing. So I had gotten like 3 wrong conclusions, but none of them came from the methods. It just came from a setting that I'd given them, a setting that I'd chosen once and reused everywhere. So while working on this project, it really made me come face to face with my skills and learning. I may have expected one thing in the beginning, but speaking with my mentor and learning that we're doing these comparisons with deep learning models and observing each model's performance, I had gotten 3 wrong conclusions basically, but none of them came from the methods. It came from the setting that I'd chosen and reused everywhere. But that's like a part of the summer that I'm like really proudest of. That fact, I mean, I shouldn't be proud of an error that I made, but the fact that I was able to look back and look for a flaw in my own experiment and was able to find it. So some personal significance and future work. So I'll leave you guys with this. So throughout the project, the setups that match the measurements best often produce the worst pictures of the ground. And fitting the data and recovering the truth are not the same thing. And on real field data, matching the measurements is the only thing you can check. That matters beyond my project. Anyone comparing methods in geophysics or anywhere else will hold some settings fixed to be fair. My work showed those shared settings can quietly manufacture the result. They have to be tested thoroughly, not assumed. Next we will extend these methods that learn from many past surveys and to real field data from Iowa and Colorado. And I would like to thank everybody that was able to help me throughout this journey and during the summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Sophia Patzkowski from the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. Sophia's project was under the direction of Dr. Chaz Bolton at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. Her title is The Influence of Drainage Conditions on Injection-Induced Seismicity Along Meter-Scale Laboratory Faults.
Okay, so before I get into what we did this summer, I'm just going to tell you what induced seismicity is. So basically you have a fault and there's going to be normal stress acting on it that pushes 2 sides of a fault together and it locks it. And then we have oil companies in this world and they need oil. So they're going to drill into the ground, extract oil. And when they extract the oil, they're also taking out this wastewater that they have no purpose for. So what they're going to do is they're going to inject it back into the ground. And when they inject it back into the ground, they're increasing pore pressure around the fault. And looking at the Moore Coulomb failure criterion, when you increase pore pressure, you're decreasing that normal stress that's locking the fault. You're also decreasing the shear strength, which is resistivity to sliding on the fault. So increasing the pore pressure, you're going to get that sliding motion and you're going to get an earthquake. So that's what we understand about everything going on here. But we lack knowledge on the factors that control these seismic events. So this summer we kind of wanted to answer some questions. So some of them being how does stress drop change when we inject at different locations on the fault? How does it change if we add a seal to block water from draining into the host rock? So this summer we worked on this 1 meter scale lab fault. And then here's a diagram of what that looks like. And then zoomed in, we had 2 acrylic blocks. That was to match conditions of a fault better. And then we have, this is the front of the fault. This is the back of the fault. And then here we have a cylinder. This is our moving block. It's pushing on our moving block to cause that shear stress. And then here, these cylinders push the blocks together to create that normal stress. And then on this stationary block, we have some sensors that detect normal stress, changes in shear stress, as well as how much the block moved during an experiment. On the fault, we also have 4 wells where we inject fluid. Okay, so this is an image of what a run looks like with the raw data. So we have shear stress versus time. These colors, these are our strain gauges. And if you look, they are basically in order of along the fault where they're located. So here's at the front, here's at the back. These are just recording the change in shear stress. And so when we do an experiment, what we do is we saturate the fault first, and then we start pushing on the moving block, and we start getting these stick slip events, which is kind of stop and go. And then we keep pushing, and then we'll stop. And then we stop within 10% of max shear strength. So we want the fault to be very much so critically stressed. So when we start injecting, we get events pretty quickly. So we'll stop. We'll let it rest. We'll start injecting fluid. And if you look here pretty quickly, we get a seismic event. And then in terms of like results, looking at like initial shear stress state versus position. So initial shear stress rate percent is from tau initial divided by tau peak. That tau initial is that stopping point. The tau peak is from averaging the peaks for each of the sensors. And if you look at here, we have 6 different runs, each having 8 different sensors to take data from. And so what we found is that the initial, at the very front of the fault, it's less critically stressed compared to the back. So the back is going to want to slip more when we start injecting. And if you look at average shear strength, which is our tau peak, you see that the front has higher average shear strength. That means it's going to be more locked. You're going to need more force to cause it to move. And if you look at the back, you're going to need less force. And then this is a stress drop plot from after we injected, so different events. And then we have points for each run. And if you look at the front, you can see that you get a higher stress drop compared to the back. And so putting all this together, we're thinking that the reason why it does this is heterogeneity and normal stress. We believe the front of the fault has higher normal stress and the back has lower normal stress. So again, it's going to take more force in the front to build up and to cause it to slip. And so if you also look at this plot, you can see that each of these runs, they have like relatively the same pattern. And again, we were looking at like injection location, and each run we injected at different locations. We had different normal stresses on them. And if you see this pattern again, like they look relatively the same. So it kind of rules out injection location as like a factor that plays into the event size. And then the next experiment that we did, we sealed the fault with this silicone O-ring and we put it inside the stationary block. And what we put it there to stop like water from leaking out of the fault when we saturated it and we're running experiments. And so what we found is that normal stress is more homogeneous. So like pore pressure and stress along the fault is like more uniform. And if you look at the front compared to the back, they're relatively the same. If you look at the runs, they're more so close together. And so overall significance of our project was like finding that the disparity between like sealing and not sealing the fault. And then significance for me was getting a lot of coding skills, learning more about like rock mechanics, faults, and earthquakes. And then here's my acknowledgement. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophia. Hey, our next presenter is Nathan Wolski from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. His project was under the direction of Dr. Asiya Aziz Zanjani at the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology in Socorro, New Mexico. Nathan's title is Characterizing Southeastern New Mexico's Velocity Structure Using Ambient Noise Tomography.
All right, thank you, Becky. So for context, the Permian Basin is the most productive oil region in the United States. You can see the whole outline of the basin on this figure on the right. So oil production in the basin has increased drastically over the years. From 2018 to 2025, production in the basin doubled. And with this growing industrial activity, we see increases in induced or man-made seismicity. Our area of focus is the Delaware Basin, which is around 10,000 square miles. It's situated in southeastern New Mexico and western Texas. And as we see this increase in oil production, events in the Delaware Basin increased from 40 to around 760 as cataloged by the New Mexico Tech Seismological Observatory. So this increasing seismicity calls for a robust crustal velocity model, which will aid in earthquake location, relocation, and overall seismic hazard assessments. So to create such a model, we employed ambient noise tomography. We started by downloading continuous local and regional waveforms from EarthScope for all these stations over here on the left. We then pre-processed and cross-correlated the waveforms between station pairs to get empirical Green's functions. Now with these Green's functions, we can manually pick dispersion measurements using the software suite computer programs in seismology. So what these dispersion measurements are, it's pretty much a graph of velocity versus period. And once we pick all those, we're able to do grid-based tomography using SurfPy, specifically the Ray tomography package, to get 2D velocity maps. And once we have those, We can then use CPS again to perform grid inversions and get our final VS model. So these are our dispersion measurements, and these specifically are the Rayleigh and Love group velocity measurements. And what these are really good at is adding resolution to our model. You see we have upwards of 600 picks for both Love and Rayleigh group velocities. So they add a lot of resolution to the model. And looking at our phase velocity picks, these cover a different velocity range, so they're better at constraining the depths of our models. So once we do the array tomography to those dispersion measurements, we get maps like this for every period in our data set. Essentially, red coloring is showing you lower velocities, blue coloring is showing you higher velocities. And these shorter periods are sampling shallower depths. So these short periods, we're looking at the basin itself here, and we can see this prominent low velocity anomaly in the central basin. One thing about this is that these really faint yellow lines are the ray paths that we use for the tomography here. And you can see there's not a whole lot of path density in these shallower periods. But when we look at more intermediate periods, we have lots of path density, but these sample below the basin into the upper crust. Once we do our final inversions, we get VS models for each of our grids. So on the left here, you see this initial model that we used, and then this bold blue line is our final model after 100 iterations. Ideally, we would stitch all these together and create a really cool velocity structure cross-section of the basin. But for the shallow and deep depth ranges of our model, it's slightly poorly constrained and non-unique. And this is simply a data density issue, which leads me to our recent field work. So for a few days this summer, we went down to the Carlsbad area and deployed a dense nodal array. On the right, you have a map of the array. It ended up being around 150 nodes. Me and the C deployed 40 of them in the light blue here. And we hope that with this data that we collect from these, we'll be able to better constrain those shallow and deep depths and get a more robust model for every grid, which of course will eventually play a really important role in seismic monitoring in the area. I'd just like to thank Steve for teaching me everything I know about seismology pretty much, and I'd like to thank EarthScope and the NSF for making this opportunity happen.
Great job, Nathan. Our next presentation is by Sienna Simms from the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. Her project was under the direction of Dr. Julie Elliott at Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan. Sienna's title is Geodetic Block Modeling of Tectonics in Western Alaska and Eastern Russia.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay. So the tectonics in the broader northern Pacific region is not very well understood because of how remote the region is, how difficult it is to keep solar powered equipment running when you're this far north, and the added complexity with the fact that there's multiple major plates colliding in this area, especially in this off the coast of eastern Russia. And so for this study, we specifically look at this northern Bering Sea region outlined in red because of the fact that as we go further north and west, this fact becomes more apparent. And so you actually see that the amount of GNSS stations in this area become relatively sparse. And so we wanted to get better constraints on this motion in general so that we can improve earthquake hazard estimates to protect vulnerable communities. And so we did a geodetic study integrating GNSS data from Eastern Russia and Western Alaska to process a new velocity field for the region, which was then used to model the motion of our defined tectonic blocks. So starting with the velocity field, we selected time series from 41 different sites that we thought had quality data, which is represented on the left with these red vectors. And this data set corrected for offsets, seasonal hydrologic loading, glacial isostatic adjustment, and post-seismic deformation. And for the fault geometry, we defined the block boundaries based on known faults in Western Alaska, seismicity maps, and general velocity fit, which is also outlined and labeled in the figure. And then we also set the defined fault segments to have a locking depth of 10 kilometers. And so these two components, along with the motion estimates for the surrounding blocks based on the previous study, was input into the block model, which then output the angular velocity of each of the blocks, which can then be represented as a linear velocity representing the block motion at a given point and the slip rates across the fault segments. So for our results, we can represent it as we did on the left with these geographic poles of rotation for each of the blocks, which is in these gray kind of clouds. And you might notice that there are 3 different colored certainty ellipses, and those are to represent 3 of the different models that we experimented with this summer. And the results that we'll be looking at today are the ones with the cyan ellipses. And we then can represent the results as these blue velocity vectors on vector predictions on the right side. And we also represent the relative velocities across the faults in red, where we have the magnitude in the circle and then the pair of arrows representing the direction. We also have the focal mechanisms plotted here for direct comparison. And so we can see that there's right lateral strike slip happening everywhere across these faults. And then there's a mix of extension in the north near these diffuse normal faulting mechanisms. And then there's a bit of compression on the other fault segments, but especially in this Koryak Highlands region where you have a lot of high compression rate, and there are a lot of these stress faulting mechanisms clustered along here. And from these results, we can make a few conclusions that there may be multiple blocks spinning the Bering Sea region, which goes against the theory that there's a singular Bering block rotating westward in this region. We can also make some generalizations about the motion for the area, where the Bering Strait is experiencing this southerly motion, and then there's Aleutian Trench parallel motion happening further south, where there is due to the flat subduction happening further east, which is then pushing this area or extruding this area further west, so that it converges with eastern Russia near the Koryak Highlands. Last, we come back to this area where the idea where there's agreement between the slip and the focal mechanisms. We represent this slightly differently in this figure below, where we isolated that fault perpendicular motion for the relative velocity or the tension from the strike slip that's happening. And then we projected the value of the tension with this color gradient along the fault lines. And so you can see the extension in the north and this compression near the Koryak Highlands. We zoom in on this area because the fact that with how tightly clustered these focal mechanisms are around it, it gives us some reassurance that our block model is able to actually represent motion that is being observed in different types of data sets, and also gives us some reassurance that our block model is able to get some decent results despite how sparse the GNSS stations are up here. And so I would like to acknowledge everybody listed here. Thank you so much for your support this summer, and also thank you to everybody here today for listening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sienna. Our final recess presentation is by Elaine Zhou from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Elaine did her project under the direction of Dr. Kevin Mackey, also at Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan. Her title is Updated Seismicity Maps of Eastern Russia and Western Alaska, 1900 to 2025, Defining Boundaries Within the Chursky Seismic Belt.
Okay. So my project also looks at the Eastern Russia and Western Alaska region, and within that, the Chursky seismic belt. So this large area, we have the Eurasian plate and the North American plate coming together. So the overall goal of this project is to understand the tectonic and plate boundaries better. And our previous seismicity maps in this region only extended to 2010, so we wanted to add in the new data all the way up to 2025. And also because of this is just a very large region, we can look at everything. So we concentrated on looking at the CSB, the Chursky seismic belt, which is this broad zone of deformation right between the Eurasian plate and the North American plate. And so to make the big map, I combined both international and regional earthquake catalogs. The Russian catalog used a different magnitude scale, so I had to convert that so everything matches up. And I also had to remove some human events like mining, constructions, also nuclear test. And which is kind of what this image is showing us how I did that. So this is a comparison between daytime and nighttime. And you can see some clusters on the daytime map that I boxed out in the blue color. They only appear in daytime, which is when us humans are outside doing stuff. So those are likely human events and were removed. And then I also added in the focal mechanisms, which is kind of what's shown here, these beach ball-like little things that's telling us how exactly the land is moving, like strike slip, thrust, and normal. And as a result of those, this is my very beautiful map of the updated region. And the yellow box there on the map is the Trisky seismic belt. And zooming into that region, there are two features that I outlined in yellow. There's the Ulukan Fault in the south and the Moma Range on the north. So along the Ulukan Fault, you can see a lot of seismic activity, which is telling us that this is definitely an active fault. You can also see that in the satellite image on the left here, kind of this fault trace just cutting through the image. However, we don't really have like much clear mechanisms from the seismicity. As you can see, like along the fault here, the mechanisms are kind of like a mix of everything, but with field studies that we did along the faults, we can see a lot of geomorphic features that match with strike slip, such as pull-apart basins, restraining bands, and fault scarps. And we have some example of field images, which the top one is a fault scarp and the bottom one is a pull-apart basin. Both are taken where this little star is on the map. And then on the north segment of the Ulukan Fault, you can see really clear river offsets. As this image on the top is showing, you have every valley with the matching valley to the left, which is telling us that the land probably slide to the left. So when you restore that, which is with what the bottom figure is showing, you can see like the river valleys really nicely realigned with each other, which is again telling us this is a strike slip fault. Then moving on to the MoMA range, we can see there's this big cluster of thrust mechanisms from the seismicity. You can also see the thrust fronts in the satellite image, which is what the little arrows are pointing at here. And this yellow line, there's a cross section along this, which is shown here. You can see this is the thrust zone and how it's dipping down. So we have the strike slip along the Ulukan Falls, and we have the thrust in the MoMA range, which together is called strain partitioning, which is when different components of this regional transpressional deformation is kind of split by different faults in the system. That's kind of what's shown in this figure down here. So overall, my project has the updated seismicity maps made, and with the new maps and the geomorphic observations, giving us a better understanding of how deformation is distributed in the region. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Great work, everyone. That concludes all of the presentations, but we will now open it up for a Q&A. If you haven't been paying attention, go ahead and check out the chat. It has been a busy spot over the last hour as we've been doing these presentations. And a lot of questions have been asked, and a lot of the interns have been responding to the questions. So please check that out. We've been kind of monitoring throughout the presentations to try to see which questions have not been answered yet. And so I will actually go ahead and start for Sophia with a question from Matt.
Oh, wait, from Matt. I thought you were talking about the other one.
Yeah, I have a different one for you that's not in the chat. Matt said, very cool experiments. In real world terms, what does a sealed fault represent, and where might we find those conditions in nature? Or did the seal serve some other purpose?
It's more so because like basically when you like inject fluid into the ground, so like basically around the ground, like around the fault, the water is gonna like seep through like the pores and like so we wanted to like seal the fault to see just basically if that has an effect. I don't know personally where that specific condition might be, but I will look into that. That's a good question.
Great, thank you. Elaine, we have a question for you from Chris. How did you find a common magnitude scaling between catalogs?
Okay, so for that, it's mainly like the Russian using the different K-class energy scale. And there's this paper that kind of talks about like how to convert that into like the more common scales, like the NBMS of those more common scales that were used in the international catalog.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question. We've got another question here for Nathan. This question is from Matt. For those unfamiliar with ambient noise tomography, what kinds of noise are you actually using to image the subsurface?
Pretty much the Earth's natural hum. So we're trying to minimize earthquake signals and everything like that. And we're trying to, with all the data pre-processing, we're kind of eliminating all this incoherent noise that we don't want to use to do our cross correlations and everything.
Thank you. We do have a little less than 10 minutes for questions still, so please type those in the chat if you have them. They don't have to be specific to the project. They can be more general about the intern experience as well. We had a little bit of that discussion in our earlier internship session this morning, so keep that in mind. Until then, we do have another question for Sophia from Casper. As natural faults often contain a higher porosity gouge layer and damage zone, do you expect injection location to be more significant for injection on a natural fault? Also, great presentation.
Oh yeah, I was just like mid replying to that one.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're totally good. I mean, I might as well just speak it out loud. So like, well, with the acrylic blocks, like it kind of like does its best to like match natural fault conditions in terms of like creating like stick slip events and all that stuff. So it's kind of hard to specifically say if it would or not because like looking at the data set I had, like it didn't. But like I've seen other papers where it could possibly have an effect. I think it like mainly if we get more knowledge on like the normal stress, I think we could have it better understanding of why that happens. But that's definitely a good question to look more into in the future. So I'd say it's kind of like up in the air, but based off of my research, it looks like possibly not.
Awesome, thank you. All right. I will ask a question. So Miranda sort of answered this in her presentation about, but I'm gonna ask someone else this question. Miranda kind of talked a little bit about a challenge that she faced and how she overcame it. So I am going to ask Sandra, what was the challenge that you encountered during your project and how did you get through it?
So my project, I was initially going to use a scanning electron microscope and for your an FTIR to get some compositional data on these samples. And unfortunately, I ran out of time. It took much longer than I thought to clean all these samples and look through them. So I ended up having to kind of pivot my project on more the surface textures of these samples instead of their actual composition. So yeah, that was that was a bit of a switch I wasn't expecting. Um, but yeah, it was still really cool to kind of dive into geology. Yeah, thinking more about the dynamics of an eruption instead.
It's a great answer. Thanks, Sandra. All right, let's see. For Miranda, was there anything that surprised you as you worked on the project this summer?
Ticks during the field work.
Ticks.
Field work. Yeah. I'm very
Great
much used
answer.
toward drier areas. So out here in the field while we're doing our ERT surveys, yeah, coming across ticks was definitely I've never seen ticks before, so that was definitely an experience. So I have my the graduate students I worked with to help me with the spray. But yeah, besides that, ticks, yeah, just realizing that like it takes a lot of like time and tuning and patience when it comes to like working with finding like a way to like work find out each model's like best qualities and how to like fit it into what I was working with the ERT inversion. So that was definitely an experience and just definitely like learning curve for sure and just learning new methods and applying like my skills as I best can to them.
Awesome. I will direct that same question at Alastair. Anything that surprised you or anything unexpected as you did this internship this summer?
Okay. In terms of unexpected, I think part of it was like the magnitude of work we ended up doing. Like at the start, we started out, we were just like, okay, we're going to just start one by one, we're going to go do all these seismograms, and we are going to like it'll be smooth sailing for like a good amount of it. And we had to do so much fun troubleshooting, and we encountered so many really interesting issues, like the fixed dips that Morgan had mentioned. That's something that like as we were scanning seismograms, we immediately recognized that as a problem. And it was really exciting to be able to come together and then to work on these problems and then figure out how this can impact like an interpretation of it, because you can absolutely be like, if you do not realize that this is an issue, um it could definitely skew results quite a bit. Towards the end, we actually found out that there's like a higher baseline in some of our graphs for the month of December. And that's also a consequence of like the same sort of fixed dips, except this time it's like a little brighter, um, that we didn't catch until the last couple weeks. So there was a lot of interpretation that was dependent on that. And then when it became not true, I was like, okay, well, I'm glad I was always sus of that to begin with. But yeah, there was a lot of fun stuff like that. The problems were the best part.
That's great. Thanks, Alastair. Sienna, we have a question in the chat from Beth, and it's sort of general, but I'll ask you, do you have any insights or learning from this summer that will influence you going forward?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well just now. Honestly, I would say like it kind of still like the fact that I really do like doing research. Like some parts of research they can be tedious, some parts they can be like really exciting. Honestly, I appreciated both in the summer, so that was really cool. And then yeah, and also it broadened my understanding because I don't really have a specific focus that I want to do in geophysics yet, though I'm like figuring that out, and this has really like broadened my scope in terms of what regions are really interesting to study and how different ways we can actually study them. So that was really fun getting to learn new things. And more in general, I learned a lot of independence this summer because I live in Maryland and I also go to school in Maryland. So I haven't like lived this far away from home despite traveling a lot. So yeah, it's been great.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Sienna. I will direct the same question at Morgan. Any insights or learning from this summer that will influence you going forward?
Yeah, that's a really lovely question. I think that the biggest thing that will influence me this summer is getting to work in a getting to do research in the environment where I had a really lovely team to work with, and what it was like for us all to have our own specific question that we were trying to answer and part of this similar problem, but to be able to bounce ideas also off of each other's head for the entire summer. It was great because I literally under the desk and work on MATLAB and then get to go to Alistair and be like, hey, tell me I'm not crazy. Look at this and tell me I'm not crazy. And that was so valuable, and learning to be able to communicate ideas. And even there were times this summer when we disagreed on what analysis might mean, or how to solve a problem. And getting to work that out and hear each other out on that was really valuable. And I think I'll carry that for my entire career.
Amazing. Lucero, I will send the same question to you. Any insights or learning that you'll carry forward with you?
Um, I think uh, mm, I think that an insight that I will carry with me is I thought it was very interesting to learn about what research can look like outside of a university. I think, like when you're an undergrad, most of the researchers you meet are like professors or they're just research scientists, but they're all like, like um in what I would consider just like very uh it's like academia, but whatever everyone kind of considers to be academia, like professors and stuff. But working, I guess, with the government, there's so many people that have PhDs and aren't professors or anything like that, but there's still like people that um produce a lot of papers and have a lot of good um I guess insight. So I think it really just opened my eyes to like, okay, there's like a whole other world of research out there that isn't just contained within a university. So that was really cool.
Love that answer. Bella, last question. Same question for you. Any insights or learning that will carry forward with you?
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me well. There's been an unexpected office door right now, but I didn't know what any of this stuff was before this summer. I had no idea this was even like a geophysical method. So now I'm like learning about it and I think it's really interesting and I might pursue graduate school on this topic. So yeah, we'll see where it goes, but
Perfect answer. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for answering the questions. You did such a fantastic job. Just so everyone on the call is aware, we do have one more session of internship presentations coming up, and that is tomorrow. Our student career interns will be doing their summer showcase tomorrow at the time on the slide. So please consider attending and supporting those interns as well. Thank you everyone for attending, for asking great questions. Great job to every single intern on the call for doing such a great job all summer long and giving such professional, incredible presentations today. So please give them one more collective round of applause with your emoji features in Zoom. There we go. And we will wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, everyone.